There are many figures who contribute to history. Most are overlooked, some command the spotlight, and some are simply forgotten. American history is no exception, with heroes, traitors, villains, and simply those who were in the right spot at the right time. But all these figures, good or bad, would contribute to this story, our story. This is Forgotten Figures. The American Civil War was an important part of the history of this country. It is full of famous figures like Frederick Douglass, the former slave who fought for the abolitionist cause, President Abraham Lincoln, generals like Ulysses S. Grant and William Sherman, and even Confederates such as Robert E. Lee and James Longstreet. An equally important figure and often overlooked hero from that war helped drive the Confederates from the Washington outskirts and bring about the surrender of Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. Let's bring the past into the present with Union General Philip Sheridan. He was born on March 6, 1831 in Albany, New York, as the third of 6 children. At some point, his family moved to Somerset, Ohio, where he would live until he won an appointment to the U.S. Military Academy at West Point in 1848. At the time, he was a bookkeeper for a general store where Congressman Thomas Ritchie was a customer and recognized him. He wasn't exactly the most promising of cadets at West Point. During his 3rd year, he was suspended for a full year after fighting with a classmate, future Brigadier General William R. Terrell. Despite this, he would go on to graduate 34th of 52 in 1853 and be commissioned a brevet 2nd lieutenant in the 1st U.S. Infantry Regiment at Fort Reading, California. The antebellum years were lackluster for Sheridan, who finally got promoted to 1st lieutenant in March 1861, and then captain shortly after the surrender of Fort Sumter. That fall, he was ordered to Jefferson Barracks, St. Louis, to join the 13th U.S. Infantry. Before he could join, he was tasked by Major General Henry Halleck to audit the Department of the Missouri's finances after General John C. Fremont let it fall into debt. Halleck was impressed by Sheridan, and in December appointed him the Chief Commissary Officer of the Army of Southwest Missouri. He later convinced Halleck to give him quartermaster responsibilities as well. In January 1862, he was assigned to Major General Samuel Curtis, who would soon have him arrested for insubordination after the Battle of Pea Ridge. Sheridan discovered officers profiteering and refused to pay for the stolen goods. Halleck had the charges dismissed, and Sheridan joined the army in time for the Siege of Corinth. Through an acquaintanceship with William Sherman, he got appointed colonel of the 2nd Michigan Cavalry on May 27, 1862. In July, he led his cavalry into action at the Battle of Boonesville, Mississippi. In his first engagement as a cavalry officer, he held off several regiments of Confederate cavalry, deflected a large flanking attack, and reported critical intelligence about the Confederate forces. His ability impressed the division commanders in the Army, as well as Brigadier General William Rosecrans, who helped get him promoted to Brigadier General in September. At this time, he would also receive a horse from a fellow officer he would name Riencenzi, which he'd ride until the end of the war. With his promotion, he was assigned to command the 11th Division, 3rd Corps, and Major General Buell's Army of the Ohio. On October 8, 1862, his efforts in the Battle of Perryville prevented Confederate reinforcements, and his aggressive action convinced Confederate Major General Leonidas Polk to remain on the defensive. On December 31, 1862, at the Battle of Stones River, Sheridan's division again held off Confederate charge and helped the Union Army make a strong defensive stand. Due to this late action, he was promoted to Major General on April 10, 1863. He would remain with Rosecrans' army throughout the Tullahoma campaign. During the Battle of Chickamauga, his division had little action in the first day. On the second day of fighting, he was ordered to shift positions and move behind the Union lines. At this point, the Confederates made a strong push into the Union center. Sheridan moved his forces and made a defensive stand on Little Hill against General James Longstreet's forces. Again, his strong defensive stand held off the Confederate charge. 2 months later, during the Battle of Chattanooga, part of Sheridan's army would join other Union forces that rushed up Missionary Ridge for a Union victory. Among those that rushed up the ridge was Arthur MacArthur, father of World War II General Douglas MacArthur. By the start of 1864, President Lincoln had named Ulysses S. Grant as General-in-Chief of the Union Army. One of his moves was to bring Sheridan to the Eastern Theater to command the Cavalry Corps in the Army of the Potomac. Sheridan was reportedly the second choice for this command, but in his memoir, written well after the fact, Grant writes that Sheridan was always the top choice. The cavalry would be committed to its traditional role of scouting and screening, and Sheridan chafed under these tactics. As Grant approached the Battle of the Wilderness with its thick undergrowth and dense forestation, the role of the cavalry became even more limited. As such, Sheridan's forces were unable to hold off the Confederate forces, an event that led to a heated discussion between Sheridan and General Meade. With Grant's permission, Sheridan was cut loose to pursue Confederate cavalry led by General Jeb Stuart. This venture would be unsuccessful in a couple of ways. For Grant, he would be blind heading into the Battle of Cold Harbor in a similar fashion that Lee was in the Battle of Gettysburg, and would earn him the nickname the Butcher. For Sheridan, he was unable to finish off the main Confederate cavalry force. However, at the Battle of Yellow Tavern on May 11th, Jeb Stuart was mortally wounded. Still, Sheridan would be promoted to lead the Army of the Shenandoah and Middle Military Division on August 7, 1864. By this point, Grant and Lee were deadlocked in Petersburg, Virginia, and Sherman was making his way to Atlanta. Confederate General Jubal Early had taken a small force and was raiding the outskirts of Washington. Sheridan's main task would be to expel Early from the Shenandoah and prevent its use to the Confederacy. Sheridan's forces would take a scorched earth approach similar to Sherman's. On September 19th, at the Third Battle of Winchester, Early's forces were pushed back, and 3 days later they were repulsed again at the Battle of Fisher's Hill. All the while, the Union forces burned barns, mills, and factories, took livestock, and tore up railroads. On October 19th, with Sheridan 10 miles away at Winchester, the Confederates launched a surprise attack on his forces at Cedar Creek. Hearing the sound of cannon, Sheridan rode to his command by 10:30 that morning and rallied his troops to stave off defeat. Because of his actions and his constant fighting, he was promoted to Major General, becoming the fourth highest-ranking officer in the Union Army, behind Halleck, Grant, and Sherman. Despite this, he would spend the remainder of 1864 fighting guerrillas and engaging in light skirmishing. In February 1865, with Grant and Lee still deadlocked in Petersburg and Sherman marching north through the Carolinas, Sheridan was given instructions to destroy the Virginia Central Railroad and James River Canal in an attempt to cut off reinforcements and food from reaching Lee. He was then ordered to capture Lynchburg and then either return to Winchester or join Sherman in North Carolina. The latter part of his instructions were more or less left open for interpretation, and with his other objectives achieved, he took his forces towards Petersburg. By March, he had rejoined the Army of the Potomac, writing, "Feeling that the war was nearing its end, I desired my cavalry to be in at the death." On March 2nd, Sheridan delivered a blow to Lee's army with the capture of Jubal Early's 1,500 troops at the Battle of Waynesboro. Then came the next blow, on April 1st, when Sheridan cut Lee's supply line at Five Forks. Then, on April 6th, at the Battle of Sailor's Creek, about 20% of Lee's army was captured. With no other option, Lee retreated from Petersburg, heading west, and 3 days later, Sheridan blocked his retreat, forcing him to surrender at Appomattox Courthouse. With that, the war was seemingly over, but a lone Confederate force remained in Texas under General Edmund Kirby Smith, and Sheridan was appointed commander of the Military District of Southwest and tasked with bringing about his surrender. By the time he arrived in New Orleans, he had heard of Smith's surrender, truly ending the Civil War. What is often forgotten about during this time is that there was almost a war with the French. In 1848, the nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte became president of France, and by 1852, he was known as Emperor Napoleon III. In 1862, he sent a force of 40,000 troops to Mexico and installed Austrian Archduke Ferdinand Maximilian as Emperor Maximilian I. Sheridan was given permission to gather a sufficient force in Texas and go to the Mexican border. He arrived with a force of 50,000 troops, and France agreed to withdraw its troops by November 1867, but this process was expedited to March 1867, and by June, Maximilian I was captured by Mexican troops and executed. Although he had helped prevent a war with France, his time in Texas wasn't all that great. In 1866, President Johnson removed him from his command after feuding over the Military Reconstruction Acts. Sheridan even joked, quote, "If I owned Texas and hell, I'd rent out Texas and live in hell," unquote. In September of that year, he was sent to Fredericksburg, Texas, to subdue the Indians. By the following August, he was appointed to run the Department of Missouri and, in a less than agreeable action, attacked many natives while they were in winter quarters. On March 4th, 1869, he was promoted to lieutenant general, and in 1870, he once again was involved in a conflict with France. this time as an observer to the Franco-Prussian War. He continued to engage in several wars with native tribes, including the Red River War, Ute War, and the Great Sioux War, which resulted in the death of Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer. Around this time, he also uttered a now famous quote that captured most American sentiments at the time: "The only good Indians I ever saw were dead," though later he did deny ever saying it. On June 3, 1875, at age 44, he married Irene Rucker, who was 22 years younger. The two would go on to have 4 kids, and after his death, Irene would never remarry. On November 1st, 1883, Sheridan would be promoted to Commanding General of the United States Army, a position he would hold until August 5th, 1888. He would end up dying in Dartmouth, Massachusetts, of heart failure. Sheridan was an important figure in the Civil War. His raiding of the Shenandoah had the same effect on the South as Sherman's march to the sea, not to mention his role in bringing Lee out of his trenches in Petersburg and his eventual surrender at Appomattox. In his post-Civil War career, he helped bring about the protection of Yellowstone in the 1870s and 80s, and its eventual national park status. He would even have a mountain named after him at Yellowstone, Mount Sheridan. In 1885, he would serve as 9th president of the NRA. Various street names and counties would be named after him, including Fort Sheridan in Chicago, which now serves as the home to the National Guard. Finally, he would be immortalized in the military for years to come with the M551 Sheridan tank. For all these reasons, he deserves to be remembered among the greats of the Civil War. If you enjoyed this video, please check out the rest of my YouTube page, and don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And you can also follow me on Twitter at PastAndPresent4. Thanks for watching.